I should just point out quickly that competition rules essentially seek to promote market competition by preventing monopolies from forming. And these can form, for example, as a result of two firms merging. Now, under the current regime, the EU deals with merger cases that affect more than one member state on behalf of all of them, either clearing or blocking the merger. So UK authorities at present are only left to deal with smaller domestic mergers and acquisitions. EU competition rules also place constraints on the government's ability to pay state aid, so subsidies, tax breaks to industries, unless it's justified, for example, on the basis for economic development or to prevent a financial institution from collapsing. I'm not going to engage in the question of whether Brexit is good or bad. The process of withdrawing from the European Union will no doubt bring a number of opportunities as well as costs. What I'm interested in is this issue of taking back control and the extent to which we can take back control. In principle, leaving the EU will allow the UK to take back control in these two areas that I've highlighted. So it'll increase our ability to block foreign acquisitions of UK firms where we don't deem them to be in the public interest. So you'll remember, for example, Kraft's acquisition of Cadbury's, which was very controversial and was dealt with by the European Commission. These sorts of cases, the large mergers, as I say, are largely dealt with by the European Commission on our behalf. So Brexit will allow decisions on those mergers to be taken by UK authorities and to be decided upon by UK judges freed from the supremacy of EU law. The second key aspect is that it will free the government from EU state aid rules and allow them to protect vulnerable UK industries with subsidies and perhaps promote British goods and services. So let's consider each of these, starting with foreign acquisitions. Now, the irony of taking back control over merger laws is that the EU rules on competition were largely shaped by the UK. The idea of minimal government intervention, of openness, of mergers being assessed on the basis of an economics assessment of the likely effects on competition and on consumers was championed by the UK and other neoliberal members of the EU. It was supported by the Netherlands, Germany, and some other member states, but was quite different to the more paternalistic, interventionist tendencies of countries like France and Italy. Incidentally, it was also the UK, under New Labour, that was one of the biggest proponents of expanding the EU to the east, which of course led to migration, which was such a big issue in the referendum. Now, despite the European Commission dealing with major mergers, EU states like France, Italy, Spain and Poland have succeeded in being far more protective of their industries from foreign acquisitions. They have done this partly by making better use of a process through which countries can intervene in European merger regulation on the grounds of public interest, like national security. But they have mainly done this by making the process of a foreign firm acquiring a French or Italian firm more onerous, or by requiring ministerial approval of the acquisition of strategic sectors. This either deters acquisitions or forces them to be watered down so that they only amount to a share in the company rather than a wholesale takeover. So not only did we largely shape the current EU rules in this area, we chose to be permissive. We encouraged foreign acquisitions and made them easy, sending out a signal that we are an open economy. Now, after Brexit, we can become more like France and exert greater control over foreign acquisitions, but it will come at a cost. For every Kraft-Cadbury's merger, or example of foreign firms buying British businesses and engaging in asset stripping or causing redundancies, there are many other examples of foreign acquisitions leading to investment and expansion in the UK. It's one of the reasons why, despite Brexit, and in contrast to France and Italy, we are the fastest growing economy in the European Union. The suggestion has been made that we should consider all mergers on public interest grounds, as well as their effects on competition and consumers. If we choose to become more protectionist in this way, there will be costs. The UK will become less attractive as a place to invest, and it will mean that more decision-making will be in the hands of politicians, whose judgments about what is in the public interest, a famously broad and ill-defined phrase, may be shaped by lobbying, the media, and even personal bias. The best balance, surprisingly, may be the system that we currently have in the UK. Mergers are subject to a predictable and transparent assessment of their effects on competition and on consumers, while the Secretary of State can intervene on public interest grounds, but only in exceptional and clearly defined circumstances. At the moment, these are national security, media plurality, and the stability of financial markets. After Brexit, the UK's Competition and Markets Authority will be able to consider all mergers. The government will be free to apply these public interest grounds more expansively, or even add to them, including new grounds which are aimed at protecting some British firms from foreign acquisition. So in this respect, we already have control with the current regime that we have. But it would be a mistake to assess every merger or foreign acquisition on public interest grounds as a matter of course. It would create uncertainty and lead to politically motivated interventions that would stop a minority of damaging acquisitions, but also discourage beneficial foreign investment at a time when the economy faces a very challenging decade ahead as we go through the process of Brexit. Now on to state aid. EU state aid rules prohibit subsidies, tax breaks, and other advantages given by government on a selective basis to firms and industries. The main exception is where it is for the purposes of economic development, such as research and development or restructuring. These rules restrict government's ability to rescue or protect individual firms or industries. In conjunction with EU procurement rules, they also make it difficult for governments to give preferential treatment to British goods. The main reason for EU restrictions on state aid are that firstly, they can distort competition. For example, a subsidy to a single firm will give them an unfair advantage over their competitors. And secondly, because they distort trade within the EU and the single market. The idea is that firms have a level playing field across the EU and do not have to contend with national champions that have the backing of state subsidies. EU state aid and procurement rules are hated by public authorities in the UK. They will not shed any tears of us withdrawing from the EU and no longer being bound by them. It has been suggested that these are key areas where the UK will take back control, allowing us to step in to save British firms and industries that are vulnerable, for example, the steel industry. Many discuss these new freedoms in a la carte terms. We can choose to do what we want after Brexit. However, the whole basis of many of the Brexit arguments and of the government's current strategy on Brexit is to enter into free trade agreements with various countries around the world and for Britain to become a centre for global trade. There are two problems with this set of expectations. The first one is that although we won't be party to EU state aid rules, we will be expected to adhere to WTO rules on subsidies, which in many ways are very similar. So, for example, they prohibit buy British-only procurement strategies and selective subsidies to key firms. So, if the government wants to give Nissan subsidies under WTO rules, they will have to offer all car manufacturers in the UK the equivalent subsidies. However, unlike the European Union, the WTO has no bite to its rules. So a lot of countries choose to ignore them or manage them. The more serious problem is the second, which is that decisions on subsidies and procurement are inextricably linked to trade deals. If you strip away free movement of people and the supremacy of EU law, the two aspects of the EU that featured most prominently in the referendum, the EU is essentially a trade agreement. As much as we would like to take back control and exert our sovereignty as an independent nation, some freedoms have to be sacrificed if we are to be an open trading nation. There is a very good reason why some of our decision-making freedom has to be sacrificed in this way. Decisions we make on subsidies and procurement will shape how other countries we trade with and compete with make their own decisions in these areas. A situation where two countries are both heavily subsidising an industry, for example aviation in Boeing and Airbus, can be very damaging. Reciprocal subsidies cancel out any advantage given to the domestic firm, making them wasteful. When Britons voted for Brexit, I very much doubt that they would have been happy with the thought of a large chunk of the money we save from the EU contributions going to the likes of Nissan for no other reason than to compensate them for the fact we're leaving the EU. It's surely far better for such money to be spent on innovation, on specialist education and business startups, all of which are likely to provide the economy with a far better return. Subsidies also protect inefficient firms by artificially shielding them from the full pressures of the market. Finally, An industrial strategy based on subsidies requires enormous faith in government's ability to spot winners, something that proved disastrous in the UK during the 1970s. Politicians deciding which industries deserve subsidies and the nature and extent of those subsidies is not all that different from the sorts of decisions governments have to make in centrally planned economies. The biggest challenge to our new freedom will come with the entering into new trade deals. If we are to have tariff-free access to the EU single market, for example, we will almost certainly have to agree to continue respecting EU state aid rules. In fact, David Davis today suggested we may even have to continue contributing to the EU budget. If we want to have free trade agreements with developing countries, it is unlikely that we will be able to protect agriculture and manufacturing to the extent that it is currently protected by the European Union. Indeed, it has already become clear that countries like India want easier migration to the UK as a condition of any trade deal, or at the very least a relaxing of visa restrictions. And remember, by the way, non-EU immigration is far greater than EU immigration. Before I finish, I would like to identify one last irony, in that other EU countries are far better at protecting and supporting their domestic industries despite EU rules on state aid and procurement. Next time you're in France, I challenge you to find one police car, postal van or public transport vehicle that is not either a Renault, Citroën or a Peugeot. Countries like France employ subtle ways of protecting their industries. In procurement, they may, for example, set specifications that only French service providers can meet. Similarly, steel industries in other EU member states enjoy various forms of assistance, such as discounts and energy costs, which allow them to be more sustainable and competitive than our own steel industry. It also has to be said more broadly that one problem the UK has as a member of the EU is that we follow the EU rules too closely. Perhaps it's our love of fair play, but other EU countries are far better at bending those rules and in some cases completely ignoring them. Some, like Ireland, in relation to the 12 billion euros in tax that Apple has been instructed to pay back to Irish taxpayers, simply say that EU state aid doesn't apply to that area. Others, like Greece and Spain, have been in plain breach of EU rules for some 30 years and keep paying the fines because they're less than the cost of adhering to whatever the rule is. Anyway, the main point of my contribution is this. A lot of the areas we think we are taking back control of in withdrawing from the European Union, we to a large extent already have control over. The position we're in today is as a result of political decisions taken by British governments to not be interventionist, to not be protectionist, and to be open to global trade. Thank you.